so much for coming this afternoon. It's really wonderful to be back in London, back in the Senate House. I've got many fond memories of seminars over the years here from when I used to work at UCL. And it's just wonderful to have people back at events in person. So thank you for staying as well. Good, okay, so speakers at today's symposium broadly been asked to talk about Hadrianic Rome and issues and themes which intersect with that whole time period. And I'm sure that those of us who were lucky enough to get to the fantastic Hadrian exhibition at the British Museum way back in 2008, seems hard to believe that it was that long ago, remember it very vividly. For those who weren't able to get to that exhibition, we're lucky enough to have Torsten Opper's linked publication, which picks up on the main themes for that event, covering things like a new elite, war and peace, architecture and identity, Hadrian's villa, Antinous, of course, and Sabina, and towards eternity at the end. Now, actually, I'm not going to be talking very much about anything relating to those key themes from Opper's volume. In the context of Hadrianic Rome, my talk today is one which is going to operate very much by a combination of zooming, a different sort of zooming, I should say, not the old sort that we now all know, and distancing. So terms borrowed from filmmaking, where the camera pulls up right close to a subject and then draws back to take up a whole vista. So in one sense, we're going to be going right to the heart of the Hadrianic imperial infrastructure in the engaging company of our biographer, Suetonius, the Emperor's imperial secretary. So you could say, who could be more of a Hadrianic figure than that? But in another sense, we're going to be stepping away from that imperial present and going back to the world of previous emperors by looking through the biographer's prism at some intriguing written artefacts, the letters preserved by Suetonius in his biographies of the Caesars. These are letters to which his role as imperial secretary gave him unique access, unless, of course, they, or at least some of them, came from another source, which is always possible, but seems unlikely for all of the selected letters. Even if, in looking at these letters from previous principates, I'm stepping away from the Hadrianic present, I hope nonetheless that in looking at some of these letters, I'll be able to give you a sense of some of the broad issues related to emperors and to the role of emperor, which interested a key Hadrianic author. And by the end of my talk today, I hope to have held up a kind of mirror, casting reflections on Hadrian from his imperial predecessors. Well, in talking about Suetonius, I say Hadrianic author, but of course his career straddles the principates of Trajan and Hadrian. And indeed, in an article that came out in JRS, Tristan Power argues that Suetonius had published all of his biographies of the Caesars before his notorious fall from favour in AD 122 under Hadrian. And as Tristan Power reminds us, quote, the only firm date we have for Suetonius's works is the dedication of at least part of the Caesars sometime in AD 119 to 122. So too, in a recent collection of essays edited by Alice Koenig and Christopher Witten, you have various people exploring the fruits of interdisciplinary dialogue between literary and socio-historical studies of the High Empire, which transcend the principates of individual emperors. So if Suetonius is partly a Hadrianic author, he's not to be seen as straightforwardly as a mouthpiece for the values and cultures of that regime. And I also need to raise here, of course, the issue of his notorious dismissal from office, together with Septicius Clarus, the Praetorian prefect and dedicatee of the Caesars, for what the Historia Albusta refers to as disrespectful over-familiarity with Hadrian's wife, Sabina. Whatever the murky reality behind the story, it projects a Suetonius whose own position switched from Hadrianic insider to outsider in a flash. even if, as looks likely, at least some of the imperial biographies were written before that peripateia. So with this caveat in mind, let us turn to Suetonius' texts and his fascinating array of embedded imperial letters. Okay, so Suetonius had a professional interest in imperial letters, as we know from a prominent fragmentary inscription from Hippo Regius in modern Algeria, honouring him and confirming his service as ab Epistulis under Hadrian as the highest and last of his posts. Playing that trusted equestrian role must have entailed dealing with active imperial correspondence of various sorts, in both Greek and in Latin. As Elder and Mullen remind us, it was only after the Hadrianic period that the post was split by language. It also gave access to archives containing previous correspondence, some of which might have been quite sensitive. Any letters selected to feature in the biographies of the Caesars therefore were situated within a much broader hinterland of other imperial letters, which remain invisible. And interestingly too, even if letters came from sources other than the imperial archives, I think it's important to stress that Suetonius' role, his special role as ab Epistulis for Hadrian, would still have given the correspondence which he selected a certain cachet. Furthermore, since there was no equivalent of our 30-year rule in the Roman world, then publishing any imperial letters in the biographies was potentially a delicate business which needed to be handled carefully. But at least the chronological gap between Suetonius' tenure as imperial secretary and the principates of the Julio-Claudian and Flavian emperors about whom he was writing alleviated some of the risks. These emperors were, after all, safely dead and buried, and more importantly, perhaps, the two dynasties also lay securely in the past. But even so, one still had to be careful of tarnishing the majesty even of dead emperors by bringing into the light discreditable material which had hitherto lain dormant, or by unearthing letters whose contents might have had uneasy contemporary resonances because of the subject matter. And we know how good Romans were at seeing one figure in terms of another one, so mapping one figure onto another one. Now, it's always possible that if Suetonius selected the letters for publication before the peripateia, which saw him lose his post as ab Epistulis and fall from Hadrian's favour, then he may have sought special permission from the emperor to include these letters, particularly those from which he quotes verbatim and at some length. Or perhaps he simply bypassed the emperor altogether. We might keep in mind too the general notion that letters in the ancient world were particularly susceptible to forgery. Even the Emperor Titus was a talented forger, as Suetonius reminds us. And letters of dubious provenance can very easily infiltrate texts where they did not originally appear. I'm thinking of the Alexander Romance, but particularly texts such as Suetonius' De Vita Caesarum, which is structurally pretty paratactic in its organisation of narrative segments. I'm not suggesting that Suetonius' biographies contain lots and lots of fake letters, but I'm just reminding you that pseudepigraphy and creative fiction have a particularly rich heritage in the epistolary sphere, and that we can't assume that every letter in the ancient world, and every part of every letter, is guaranteed to be genuine. And also worth highlighting, I think, is the fact that just because Suetonius had held the role of imperial secretary, this doesn't mean to say that none of these letters hadn't been circulating through other media. So there's a various array of different possible routes for these letters to have ended up, I think, in Suetonius' biographies. Okay, so broadly speaking, there are two distinct varieties of reference to imperial letters which pepper Suetonius' biographies. First of all, there are brief mentions of particular letters where the contents or an individual point is summarised. And also you get nuggets of fascinating information about the epistolary practices of various individual emperors. Then there are the verbatim quotes and long extracts from letters where the identity of the writer and sometimes, but not always, the recipient are given. We'll turn to the verbatim letters presently, but I want to make a few general observations about the epistolary landscape as presented in the biographies. And one point to notice is that almost every biography across the different books includes at least brief references to individual letters, and these are distributed fairly evenly actually across the work, although naturally there are more references in the longer biographies and some degree of tailing off. This pattern is a conspicuous point of difference from the verbatim quotations from letters, which, as we will see, cluster predominantly in the Dies Julius and, above all, in the Augustus, with a short coda of verbatim letters out there in the Gaius, Tiberius and Claudius. But after that, the verbatim quotations from letters pretty much disappear. So whilst the footprints of letters and references to the paraphernalia and practices of letter writing are pretty evenly spread across the whole work, the verbatim letters are front-loaded. Now, on your handout, which is very much not something to necessarily pore over every detail, it's more of a sort of take-home treat, hopefully, you will see some of the material that I'm talking about, but through all of the references to the letters and letter writing is included there, so don't worry, you'll get home eventually. So, yeah, we can just pick out some illuminating snapshots, I think, from within them. For example, Suetonius tells us that Julius Caesar's private letters included some parts that were actually written in code, to which Suetonius helpfully gives us the key. Or there is Augustus's habit, where he not only puts a date on his letters, but he gives the exact hour of the day or night when it was written. I suppose that's a detail which suggests that he was, potentially writing quite a lot of letters in any one given day, and that things were moving quickly, potentially. Or, rather more grimly, we learn that Augustus had the legs of his secretary Thallus broken for divulging the contents of a letter for money. Not a good idea. This was obviously an extreme response. These are I'm going through these examples on the screen here, but that's a particularly memorable one and a vivid reminder of the sensitivities surrounding letters and the bond of trust which was necessary between an imperial secretary and his emperor for that relationship to flourish. Now, one other aspect of these broad references to letters in the biographies is that if you think of letters as being divided, broadly speaking, into two big categories, public and private, then there are far more references to public letters than there are to private ones in the biographies. Suetonius tells us, for example, about Tiberius refraining from using the title Augustus, except in letters to foreign rulers, despite being entitled to use the title. Or we've got Caligula's boastful letter to the Senate, as if he had conquered Britain. But references to this type of public correspondence far outweigh the private letters, although there are still a very few intriguing examples of these, such as mention of Drusus the Elder's letter to his brother Tiberius, suggesting that they write to Augustus and ask him to reinstate the Republic. A letter which Tiberius is said spitefully to have shown around. That's the danger of a letter. Once something's in writing, it can be shown to other people, whether you like it or not. I don't know how far we should believe this story, given the famously close relationship between the two brothers, but it's an interesting example of a private letter. Or there's brief mention of a private letter from Otho to Vitellius, inviting him to become his father-in-law, so brokering deals in the background that would have a fundamental effect on the future of the principate, potentially. And there's another one from Otho to Vespasian, possibly a forged one, Suetonius tells us, urging him to take revenge for him after his death. It may be that this distribution in the broad citations where references to public letters outweigh private ones reflects the material available to Suetonius in the Imperial Archive. And in the case of sensitive private letters, it does, of course, seem more likely than not that the authors of such correspondence might well have decided to destroy the letters rather than put them in some kind of archive. Perhaps there just weren't the rich pickings available in the archives for which Suetonius might have hoped. Or alternatively, he may perhaps have initially mined them for other reasons, perhaps for points relating to philology or literature, and then didn't or perhaps couldn't go back for further exploration. That would certainly make sense of the flavour of some of the letters from which he quotes verbatim. Wider awareness of the potential trouble caused by the survival of that sort of material can be seen, for example, in Suetonius's reference to the Emperor Otho before his suicide, burning his private correspondence precisely in order to avoid incriminating people after his death. Now, one other conspicuous point about these broad references to letters in the biographies is that they're all written by men, and two men, where we know the recipients, who aren't always specified. There's only one reference to a letter where a woman features at all, and that is as subject matter in a rude letter written to the Senate by Caligula, describing his grandmother Livia as being of low birth. So the world of letters projected in these biographies at the general level, and I stress this point actually at the general level, is certainly a very masculine one, and I think this observation is likely to be related to a point which I made earlier about public correspondence outweighing private correspondence in these sorts of reference. I emphasise, however, that this observation about gender relates specifically to the general brief appearances of letters in the biographies, and not to the verbatim letters to which I now want to turn. So, letters in extenso. As Cynthia Doman has observed, the use of other people's words is one of Suetonius's most distinctive biographical techniques. She's talking here mainly about Suetonius's tendency to ventriloquize emperors using short, memorable, direct verbal utterances, such as when Titus's generosity is encapsulated in his words to his friends on a dark day when after dinner he realises with dismay that he has not given out any gifts. Friends, he says, I've wasted a day, amici diem perdidi. So alongside that sort of pithy, direct quotation of short verbal utterances, jostling for our attention, sit the longer extracts taken from letters. And on the handout, I've assembled the verbatim quotes for you under note 2, which you can chew over later on. But I think various features characterise them, and I just want to give you a brief overview of these. So Suetonius quotes verbatim from 21 letters, and out of these, an impressive 19 were written by Augustus, and only 2 by other people. So you get one by Antony to Augustus, and another one, Tiberius writing to the Senate. Ruth Morello actually has a very interesting article about Tiberius as a letter writer in Tacitus's Annales, just as a point of comparison there. Now, not every quotation from a letter has a named addressee specified, and in some cases, actually, the identity of the addressee doesn't really affect Suetonius's point. He's not really interested in that kind of a epistolary context, particularly. But of the 17 letters which do have named addressees, we get 10 letters written to Tiberius, 3 to Livia, 2 to Agrippina the Elder, 1 to Augustus's daughter Julia, and finally 1 to Lucius Vinicius, and that letter is the one about Julia. So the letters, in terms of their writers, recipients, and subject matter, cluster centripetally around the imperial household. So Augustus has absolutely got the lion's share of letters as writer, and strikingly, he's the only emperor in the De Vita Caesarum whose letters are cited. Tiberius dominates as addressee, but the imperial women are certainly present, both as subject matter and as addressees. And indeed, by far the most extensive quotations are from 3 of Augustus's letters to his wife Livia. All except one letter, the one from Tiberius to the Senate, private correspondence about domestic, personal and family matters. The topics covered by Augustus range quite broadly. They include a plea to Tiberius to control his anger, a reprimand to Vinicius for over-familiarity with Augustus's daughter Julia. I find that an interesting one in a kind of oceanic context as well, if you think about Sabina. There's also relaxed and affable chat about food and about gambling, one of Augustus's favourite activities, it seems. There's advice to Agrippina the Elder about good and becoming conduct, and well wishes for Tiberius before a military campaign. There's also concern over Tiberius's health expressed in one letter, and some information about practical arrangements about a future visit by Caligula to Augustus. And some anxious ruminations which culminate in a decision about how to handle the public appearances of the disabled Claudius in such a way as not to embarrass the imperial family. Latin dominates the letters, but as we'll see, Augustus has an intriguing way of changing over into Greek at strategic moments, and in that connection, Elder and Mullin, in their book, Studying Bilingualism in Roman Letters, comment on the striking nature of Augustus's epistolary code switching. Now, the absolute dominance of verbatim quotes from Augustus's letters stands out, and this has naturally led to some speculation that Suetonius had unusual access to Augustus's unpublished correspondence, whether via the imperial archives or from another source. And it's led to speculation too that his dismissal as Epistulis might have closed off access to imperial letters. And that may be right. It's possible to overstate or just assume, though, the sort of treasure trove status of the imperial archives. But as David Wardle emphasises, Suetonius' claim to autopsy of original autograph material from Augustus is significant. For example, his observation that when Augustus was challenged for space in writing, he doesn't divide words or carry them over from the end of one line to the next, but instead puts them immediately below the word and draws a little line around them. And that sort of detail is important because it suggests first-hand seeing of the letters themselves, or that kind of autopsy, and access to some novel material, not mediated through an analytic historian or a biographer. Wherever it came from, Suetonius' use of Augustus's correspondence was certainly appealing in bringing alive the figure of Augustus. As Mike Trapp has summed up, there are, generally speaking, 3 main functions of letters in ancient biographical writing. So he comments on how they are used to illuminate particular aspects of a person's character. Secondly, to prove or to deny a particular point that is under discussion. And thirdly, as narrative events in their own right. So in the remaining time available, I want to look briefly at the most complete letter that we've got from Augustus, which is an extraordinarily vivid piece of epistolary evidence embedded in Suetonius' imperial biographies. Just put some of the text up here. So it comes early in the biography of Claudius, and it shines a spotlight into the dark corners of the imperial household as Augustus writes to his wife Livia, Livia about the disabled Claudius. So on the screen, therefore, you now is the opening of the letter, which begins as follows. So he says, I've talked with Tiberius, my dear Livia, as you requested, with regard to what is to be done with your grandson Tiberius at the Games of Mars. Now, we're both agreed that we must decide once and for all what plan we are to adopt in his case. For if he be sound, and so to say complete, what reason have we for doubting that he ought to be advanced through the same grades and steps through which his brother has been advanced? So just to make a couple of observations about that passage, I think the first thing I want to comment on is this, as you requested at the start there, it shows that Augustus is being responsive to his wife's suggestions, and also I think it suggests that Livia values the views of her son Tiberius and tries to foster good relations between father and stepson in this kind of forward planning. Secondly, I find that reference to "we are both agreed" intriguing. So in the Latin there, uterque nostrum, following from the reference to the future emperor Tiberius, might just suggest that Augustus meant the two men, himself and Tiberius here. But actually he doesn't mean that. I take it that by we, Augustus means himself and Livia. So he appears very much to be treating her as an equal who is as invested in the decision about Claudius's future as he is. Now, back to the letter. So this is how it continues. But if we realise that he is wanting and defective in soundness of body and mind, we must not furnish the means of ridiculing both him and us to a public which is wont to scoff at and deride such things. Surely we shall always be in a stew if we deliberate about each separate occasion and do not make up our minds in advance whether we think he can hold public offices or not. So Augustus's use of Greek is one of the striking points here and before. So in talking about Claudius's disabilities, he keeps them at arm's length by switching to Greek, and there might be a little bit of a feeling here of taboo. I'm certainly not suggesting that the Greek is straightforwardly meant to hide anything here, or is anything like the equivalent of Julius Caesar's code. There's a very interesting discussion actually in the Elder and Mullen book about the possible sort of Greek medical resonances of using Greek at this point. I think interesting too is the very basic point that Livia is the recipient and that she will be able to get her teeth into the Greek. So she's a bilingual presence in the background. And of course, what stands out here as well is Augustus's sensitivity to public opinion, a key feature. Back to the letter again. So it continues. However, as to the matters about which you ask my present advice, I do not object to his having charge of the banquet of the priests at the Games of Mars, if he will allow himself to be advised by his kinsman, the son of Silvanus, so as not to do anything to make himself conspicuous or ridiculous. That he should view the games in the circus from the imperial box does not meet with my approval, for he will be conspicuous if exposed to full view in front of the auditorium. I am opposed to his going to the Alban Mount or being in Rome on the days of the Latin festival, for why should he not be made prefect of the city if he's able to attend his brother at the Mount? Here again in this section we see Augustus highlighting very much the sort of see and be seen nature of the imperial role and showing sensitivity about the collective public gaze and the conclusions which people might draw more widely about the family if Claudius is visible in the imperial box. And then just the last bit of the letter. So Augustus says, you have my views, my dear Livia. in essence, that I desire, but something be decided once and for all about the whole matter, to save us from constantly wavering between hope and fear. That's an interesting phrase to use. Moreover, you may, if you wish, give this part of my letter to our kinswoman Antonia also to read. So this last section of the letter is interesting because it suggests that the original letter might actually have been rather more wide-ranging than just the part we've got here, so there's some sort of sense of exerting. And also because of the generational hierarchy. So the husband and wife team of Augustus and Livia take the lead in deciding family policy, whilst Claudius's mother Antonia is relegated to the role of bystander. Although from other things we read about Antonia, it may be that she would be quite happy to step back from taking any kind of decisions about Claudius. So Augustus clearly trusts his wife to deal with the potentially tricky matter of talking to Antonia about the future role of her son. Okay. So to conclude now, I think by any standards, this letter that we've just been looking at is a fascinating fly-on-the-wall glimpse at the inner workings of the imperial family. Wouldn't it be intriguing, for example, if we had access to letters exchanged between, say, the Queen and Prince Philip about various problem members of their own? Which we won't have for a while. But in a Hadrianic setting, I find it particularly intriguing that Suetonius chose to quote at such length from this of all letters of Augustus. Although the subject matter is safely in the past, there is an obvious and sharp contrast between then and now. The piece of correspondence that we've been looking at between an emperor and his wife very much showcases a couple who are working together in a constructive and collaborative way to deal with a private family problem in such a way as to minimise the adverse impression that it might create amongst the wider public. And how different is this image from the distant and notoriously toxic relationship between Hadrian and Sabina, preserved in the literary tradition, even before the arrival on the scene of Antinous in perhaps 123. Is it possible that Suetonius' decision to showcase this letter from Augustus to Livia might have been informed perhaps by his growing awareness of the isolation and unhappiness of Hadrian's wife, Sabina? Maybe we can even think of it as a kind of subtle nudge from Hadrian's private secretary to suggest that he should start to behave differently. Certainly the snapshot of the functional and practical working relationship between Augustus and Livia couldn't be more of a contrast than the contemporary imperial marriage of Hadrian and Sabina. And whatever the truth behind the story about Suetonius' over-familiarity with Sabina, he did, it seems, have access to her and know her well. And as we know from one of Pliny's letters, Suetonius comes across as quite a shy man, the sort of man who might, after all, have preferred indirect rather than direct confrontation of an emperor for whom he worked. So thank you very much for listening. I think that's all I'm going to say today about the letters, but they are really a fascinating collection of artefacts, embedded artefacts. So thanks very much.